Picture this. April 28, 1949. A mountain road winding through the Italian Alps near Bolzano, where post-war chaos still lingers in valleys that served as escape routes for war criminals fleeing Allied justice. Oberst Friedrich Weber, a 53-year-old former Wehrmacht colonel from Vienna, rides a BMW R75 motorcycle through morning fog, heading toward Switzerland with documents that Austrian denazification authorities desperately want to examine. At 0634 hours, Italian border police at Brenner Pass record a German civilian on motorcycle passing through checkpoint, documents showing him as Franz Müller, Austrian businessman traveling to Zurich for commercial purposes. At 0637 hours, Weber accelerates into alpine curves that he's memorized during weeks of planning this escape route. At 0849 hours, when Weber fails to arrive at the Swiss checkpoint where his forged papers were supposed to gain him entry, both Italian and Swiss authorities begin searching the mountain passes. They find nothing. No motorcycle, no body, no evidence of accident on roads that claim lives regularly during fog season. For 76 years, Oberst Friedrich Weber will remain missing, listed in Allied war crimes files as fled to South America using rat lines that Vatican connections allegedly facilitated. Until 2025, when Alpine rescue teams responding to a glacial melt-induced avalanche discover that a remote mountain refuge contains a sealed garage, finding a BMW R75 motorcycle perfectly preserved, documents bearing Weber's real name, and evidence that he didn't flee to Argentina on that April morning. He discovered something in those Italian mountains that 3 governments had spent 76 years ensuring stayed buried beneath alpine snow and Cold War amnesia. Friedrich Weber wasn't a typical war criminal. Born in 1896 to Viennese academic family, he'd served in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I, transitioned into Austrian military service during the interwar years, and been incorporated into the Wehrmacht after the Anschluss in 1938 when Germany annexed Austria. His wartime service had been primarily logistical, coordinating supply operations in occupied territories, managing resources that kept German forces functioning as they fought across Europe. But Weber's position had given him access to information that conventional combat officers never saw. Supply chains revealed where materials were going and what they were supporting. Resource allocation documents showed which projects received priority funding even as conventional military operations struggled with shortages. And logistics networks connected to intelligence operations that Weber, with his organizational skills and discretion, had been trusted to facilitate without asking questions about their ultimate purposes. His assignment to Vienna in 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany, had involved coordinating evacuation of sensitive materials from territories the Wehrmacht was abandoning to Soviet advance. Official orders specified removing military equipment and documents. But Weber had also been involved in operations that moved materials that Allied investigators would later struggle to account for. Art stolen from Jewish families, gold confiscated from occupied territories, and documents related to research programs that various factions within the collapsing Reich were attempting to preserve regardless of which power ultimately claimed victory. Weber's personal diary, fragments of which Austrian authorities had recovered during initial denazification proceedings in 1946, documented his growing awareness that Germany's defeat was inevitable and that survival required planning. In December 1944, he'd written words that investigators would analyze for decades. "The Reich is dying. Everyone who understands logistics can see that we lack resources to continue fighting effectively, but various groups are preparing for what comes after defeat. Some plan to fight on as guerrillas, others are moving assets that could fund future operations, and a few are preserving research and intelligence that might serve as bargaining chips with whichever power we eventually negotiate with. My position gives me access to these operations, and access creates options for survival that soldiers without such knowledge won't possess." His arrest by American forces in May 1945 had been routine, part of systematic roundup of German military officers. Initial screening had identified him as logistics officer without significant war crimes involvement, and he'd been processed through POW facilities before being released to Austrian denazification authorities in early 1946. But subsequent investigations had revealed troubling gaps in his account of wartime activities. Materials he'd been responsible for moving couldn't be fully accounted for. Operations he'd coordinated involved destinations that made no strategic military sense unless they'd been serving purposes he hadn't disclosed. Austrian authorities had summoned Weber for additional questioning scheduled for May 1949. But on April 28, the day before he was supposed to appear, Weber had disappeared from his Vienna apartment, taking only basic belongings and the BMW R75 motorcycle he'd purchased using funds that investigators suspected came from assets he'd hidden during the war's final months. The motorcycle, a military model adapted for civilian use, was capable of handling alpine conditions that would defeat ordinary vehicles. BMW R75s had been used by Wehrmacht forces throughout the war, their combination of power and reliability making them ideal for military dispatch riders. Weber's choice of this specific vehicle suggested he'd planned his escape carefully, selecting transportation that could navigate mountain routes where conventional pursuit would be difficult. Italian border police records from April 28, 1949, showed that a man matching Weber's description, using identity documents identifying him as Franz Müller, had crossed into Italy at Brenner Pass. The documents had appeared legitimate to border guards conducting routine checks, and Müller's stated purpose, business travel to Switzerland, was common enough that it raised no suspicions. He'd been waved through, and according to official records, that should have been the end of Weber's presence in Italy. But Weber never arrived in Switzerland. Swiss border authorities, alerted by Austrian police after Weber's failure to appear for questioning, confirmed that no one matching his description or using his known aliases had crossed into Switzerland during late April or early May 1949. Italian authorities were contacted, asked to search for German man on BMW motorcycle who might have experienced accident on Alpine roads. Searches focused on main routes between Brenner Pass and Swiss border, checking accident sites and hospitals for any sign of Weber. They found nothing. The motorcycle hadn't been involved in any reported accidents. No hospitals had treated anyone matching Weber's description, and increasingly, investigators concluded that Weber must have deviated from the expected route, possibly meeting Confederates who'd helped him reach different destination than Switzerland. The prevailing theory, supported by intelligence about escape networks operating through Italy, was that Weber had connected with rat lines that moved former Nazis to South America, probably traveling to Genoa where ships departed regularly for Argentina. Allied war crimes investigators maintained Weber in their files as fugitive who'd escaped justice, likely living under assumed identity in Buenos Aires or Montevideo. Periodically through the 1950s and 60s, his name would surface in reports about Nazi networks in South America, but confirmed sightings were never established. By the 1970s, Weber was presumed dead, another war criminal who'd escaped accountability and died in comfortable exile funded by assets stolen during the war. For 76 years, the Italian Alps kept whatever secrets they held about Friedrich Weber's fate. The region transitioned through decades of economic development, from post-war reconstruction to tourism boom that transformed mountain villages into ski resorts. Roads that had been dangerous tracks in 1949 became modern highways. Valleys that had hidden desperate refugees became vacation destinations. And throughout these transformations, the mountains witnessed but didn't reveal what had happened to Oberst Weber on that foggy April morning. In 2024, climate change accelerated glacial melting throughout the Alps, exposing terrain that had been ice-covered for decades or centuries. In March 2025, an avalanche triggered by this melting swept down a mountainside near an abandoned refuge that had served mountain climbers and smugglers in earlier eras. Alpine rescue teams responding to assess damage discovered that the avalanche had exposed structures that hadn't been visible for decades, including what appeared to be a garage or storage building attached to the refuge. Investigation on April 15, 2025, revealed that the garage door, though weathered, was intact and locked with mechanisms that suggested deliberate sealing rather than casual abandonment. Italian authorities authorized careful entry, curious about what mountain structure might contain that warranted such preservation. When the doors were finally opened on April 22, 2025, investigators found themselves staring at a BMW R75 motorcycle, perfectly preserved by the sealed environment, bearing Austrian license plates from 1949. Documentation found with the motorcycle identified it as belonging to Friedrich Weber, and archival searches revealed his connection to wartime logistics, his disappearance in April 1949, and allied suspicions that he'd been involved in activities requiring accountability he'd evaded through flight. What lay in the refuge beyond the garage would finally explain what had happened to Oberst Weber 76 years earlier. The Alpine Refuge beyond the garage contained rooms that no official records acknowledged had existed. Italian and Austrian investigation teams carefully explored spaces approximately 25 meters long and 12 meters wide, built into the mountainside with engineering that suggested wartime German military construction adapted for long-term civilian occupancy. The refuge had been deliberately sealed after Weber's arrival, creating an environment that preserved materials from 76 years of alpine weather and political transformation. The refuge's organization revealed a complex story. One section contained living quarters, simple but functional furnishings suggesting long-term residence rather than temporary shelter. But another section held filing cabinets, document storage, and materials that explained why Oberst Friedrich Weber had abandoned his escape to Switzerland and remained in this isolated mountain location for reasons that challenged every assumption about his motivations and loyalties. The investigation team's first discovery was a journal near the refuge's entrance, containing entries in Weber's distinctive handwriting. The journal began on April 28, 1949 at 0912 hours, just hours after Weber had crossed into Italy at Brenner Pass. Arrived at Alpine Refuge as arranged. Contact from Edelweiss Network was waiting, provided access codes, and confirmed that facility is prepared for extended occupation. This refuge has been maintained since 1945 as safe location for individuals who possess information that multiple parties want preserved, but which public disclosure would complicate. I'm one of several Germans who've been brought here not to escape justice, but to serve purposes that transcend simple prosecution or exoneration. The subsequent entries documented what happened during Weber's first days in the refuge, revelations that explained everything about his disappearance. April 29, 1949. I've spent 24 hours reviewing materials stored here and meeting with others who've been brought to this network. The Edelweiss Network isn't an escape route for war criminals. It's a preservation program for individuals who possess knowledge that Allied intelligence, Soviet intelligence, and even elements within occupied German administration all recognize has value that prosecution would destroy. We're being kept in controlled isolation, debriefed extensively, and our knowledge is being synthesized into intelligence that serves all parties without any single party claiming exclusive access. Weber's journal revealed his growing understanding that the Edelweiss Network represented something unprecedented in post-war arrangements. May 2, 1949. The network coordinator, who identifies himself only as Brenner, has explained the program's logic. The war produced individuals whose positions gave them knowledge about operations, resources, and networks that no single intelligence service fully understands. Prosecuting us would either reveal information that creates diplomatic complications or lose information that might prove valuable. Allowing us to escape to South America means information becomes unavailable to any party, but bringing us to controlled locations where we can be debriefed while being kept officially missing creates arrangement that serves collective intelligence interests without creating public accountability problems that prosecution or obvious escape would generate. The journal documented Weber's debriefing sessions throughout spring and summer of 1949. May 15, 1949. Today's session focused on logistics operations in Austria during 1944 to 1945. I was asked to describe in detail how materials were moved from Vienna to various locations as Soviet forces advanced. What routes were used, what vehicles and personnel were involved, where materials ended up. The debriefers represent multiple intelligence services, asking questions that reflect different priorities but which all focus on understanding networks that continued operating after official German surrender. They're particularly interested in materials I helped move that weren't standard military equipment or documents, article, gold, research materials, and most significantly, personnel who were evacuated using logistics channels I coordinated. Weber's journal revealed that his debriefing involved not just providing information, but also analyzing how various parties had been using logistics networks for purposes that official military records never documented. June 3, 1949. Brenner has shown me intelligence from other network participants. I'm seeing patterns I never understood during the war. Logistics operations I thought were serving Wehrmacht needs were actually facilitating multiple agendas simultaneously. Materials I moved were serving German military purposes but also intelligence objectives of groups within the Reich who were preparing for post-war arrangements. Some materials went to locations that Americans later secured. Others went to areas Soviets later controlled. And significantly, some went to neutral territories where they remained accessible to parties from all sides who coordinated through channels that official diplomacy couldn't acknowledge. The journal documented Weber's growing awareness that he'd been part of arrangements far more complex than he'd understood during the war. His logistics expertise and access had made him valuable not just to Wehrmacht, but to various intelligence factions who'd been using military channels for purposes that transcended winning the war. By 1949, with those factions now serving different governments in the emerging Cold War, Weber's knowledge about how materials had been moved and where they'd ended up made him valuable intelligence asset whose capture by any single party would disadvantage others. But Weber's journal also documented his realization that the Edelweiss network involved accepting permanent exile from conventional life. July 12, 1949. I've been here 11 weeks. Brenner has made clear that my status is permanent unless circumstances change dramatically. I can't return to Austria or Germany without risking arrest and prosecution that would expose network operations. I can't flee to South America because doing so would make my knowledge unavailable to parties who want continued access. I'm effectively imprisoned in this refuge, my existence acknowledged only by intelligence services who need me available for consultation, but who can't admit they're protecting someone who should face denazification proceedings. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Weber had indeed remained in the Alpine Refuge for years after his reported disappearance. A second journal, covering the period from 1949 to 1958, revealed that Weber had lived in isolation punctuated by periodic debriefing sessions, consultations when intelligence services needed his expertise, and occasional visits from other network participants who'd been brought to the refuge for coordination meetings. This second journal painted a detailed picture of Weber's life in the network during the 1950s. Reading extensively from books provided by network coordinators, writing detailed memoirs about his wartime service that were intended not for publication but for intelligence archives, occasionally meeting with historians and intelligence analysts who needed his perspective on events and operations that official records documented incompletely, and wrestling constantly with isolation, guilt about wartime activities, and questions about whether his cooperation with the network was serving justice or evading it. The journal documented several instances where Weber's knowledge had been crucial to intelligence operations. In 1950, when Soviet intelligence attempted to locate materials that had been moved from Vienna in 1945, Weber had provided information that allowed Western services to secure those materials before Soviets could access them. In 1952, when disputes arose about ownership of art confiscated during the war, Weber had documented which pieces had been moved through which channels, helping resolve claims that official records couldn't address conclusively. In 1953, when Stalin's death created uncertainty about Soviet intelligence operations, Weber had participated in assessments of what information Soviets might possess about wartime logistics networks and what vulnerabilities those networks might create if exposed. And in 1956, when Hungarian uprising briefly raised hopes that Soviet control over Eastern Europe might weaken, Weber had consulted on how logistics networks from the war might be reactivated to support resistance movements if political opportunities materialized. But the journal also documented immense psychological costs, complete isolation from family who believed he'd either fled to South America or died. Inability to maintain identity as Friedrich Weber, living instead as Hans Steiner, Austrian refugee who'd supposedly emigrated from Soviet zone. Growing awareness that his knowledge was becoming less valuable as participants in wartime operations died, and as Cold War created new intelligence priorities that made 1940s logistics operations increasingly irrelevant, and recognition that he'd traded potential accountability for information he'd possessed in exchange for life in mountain refuge that was part archive, part prison, part monument to arrangements that governments preferred remained secret. The entries from late 1950s showed a man wrestling with isolation and obsolescence. September 23, 1957. I've been here 8 years. 8 years of providing information that multiple intelligence services found valuable, but which becomes less relevant as memories fade and as new conflicts create new priorities. Brenner has hinted that my debriefings are becoming less frequent, that most of what I knew has been extracted and documented. I'm transitioning from intelligence asset to historical curiosity, kept in refuge not because I'm currently valuable, but because releasing me would create complications that maintaining status quo avoids. The journal revealed that Weber had requested release from network custody in 1958, arguing that he'd provided all information he possessed, and that continued isolation served no purpose except avoiding accountability for wartime service that denazification processes had largely completed for Germans with similar backgrounds. The Network Coordination Committee had agreed, with conditions reflecting both pragmatism and risk management. Weber couldn't return to Austria or Germany under his real name without triggering investigations that might expose network operations, but he could be relocated to South America under assumed identity, provided with resources to establish new life, and allowed to live out remaining years with understanding that revealing network existence would endanger not just himself but others who'd participated in post-war intelligence arrangements that governments had never publicly acknowledged. Weber's final journal entry was dated February 14, 1958. Tomorrow I leave. I'll travel to Argentina under identity as Hermann Becker, Austrian technician who emigrated seeking opportunities that post-war Europe couldn't provide. I'll live in Buenos Aires, work in industries that need European expertise, and try to build something resembling normal life from fragments of identities I've accumulated. My family will never know I survived. Austrian authorities will never learn what arrangements were made to preserve knowledge I possessed. And I'll spend remaining years wondering if trading accountability for information service was morally defensible or simply convenient rationalization for avoiding consequences I deserved to face. The investigation team found documentation of Weber's relocation in files that network successors had maintained through decades. He'd lived in Buenos Aires under his assumed identity from 1958 until his death in 1982 at age 86. He'd worked as technical consultant for German and Austrian companies operating in Argentina, earned reputation for expertise in logistics and supply chain management, and maintained low profile that attracted no attention from Nazi hunters or journalists investigating German exile communities. He'd never married, never formed close relationships that might have required explaining gaps in his history, and never revealed his actual identity even during final years when age and irrelevance made exposure unlikely to create significant consequences. He'd maintained minimal contact with network coordinators throughout his life, available for consultation if his expertise was ever needed again, though by the 1970s the consultations had ceased as his knowledge became historical curiosity rather than actionable intelligence. Most significantly, Weber had written a comprehensive memoir in his final years, discovered among materials in the Alpine Refuge. The memoir explained what the Edelweiss network had been, justified his choice to cooperate despite implications for accountability, and provided detailed documentation of wartime logistics operations that historians had never fully understood. He'd intended the memoir for eventual release, believing that after sufficient time and after key participants had died, the story deserved documentation as evidence of how post-war intelligence arrangements had prioritized information preservation over justice. That memoir provided the most comprehensive explanation of the Edelweiss network that investigators had ever received. Weber argued that the network had served pragmatic purposes that Cold War realities made necessary, even if justice considerations made them uncomfortable. Individuals who possessed valuable knowledge about wartime operations couldn't simply be prosecuted without losing information that multiple intelligence services needed. Allowing them to escape completely meant information became unavailable to any party. But creating controlled isolation where they could be debriefed while being kept officially missing served intelligence interests without creating public accountability problems. He acknowledged moral complications. Arguments could be made that the network facilitated escape from justice, that individuals who should have faced prosecution instead received protection, and that intelligence priorities shouldn't override accountability for wartime actions. But he also argued that absolutist approaches to justice would have destroyed knowledge that ultimately served historical understanding and prevented intelligence services from operating effectively during period when Soviet expansion threatened Western interests. The most revealing documents in the refuge were letters Weber had written to his family throughout his years in isolation and exile, letters he'd never sent but which documented his continuing connection to relationships he'd abandoned. The letters explained his choices, described his work providing intelligence, detailed his psychological struggles with isolation and guilt, and asked forgiveness for pain his disappearance had caused. The final letter, dated November 8, 1981, just months before Weber's death, contained words that would haunt everyone who read them. To my family, if you're reading this, someone discovered these letters after my death and decided you deserved truth despite security classifications. I disappeared in 1949 not to escape justice, but because I possessed knowledge that multiple governments wanted preserved. I spent 9 years in Alpine Refuge being debriefed and then 24 years in Argentina living under false identity. I became Hermann Becker and lived a life that had meaning, but which was built on deceptions that corrupted everything. Whether trading accountability for information service was justified, whether serving intelligence interests excused avoiding consequences I might have deserved, I honestly don't know. I chose information preservation over justice. And I've paid for that choice through decades of isolation, exile, and awareness that my family believed I'd fled like a coward when reality was more complex than flight or courage could describe. The Italian government's response to the refuge discovery followed established patterns. The site was classified, contents were catalogued under restrictive protocols, and consultations were held with Austrian, German, American, and other governments about handling evidence of arrangements that complicated official narratives about post-war justice and intelligence operations. Consensus emerged that the refuge would be described as wartime construction later used by refugees, that Weber's motorcycle would be exhibited as historical artifact without full explanation of circumstances, and that truth about Edelweiss network would remain largely classified. But Weber's descendants were contacted, given information authorities determined was appropriate. In July 2025, his grandson Klaus received notification from Austrian authorities. Oberst Weber had disappeared in 1949, but not to escape to South America through typical rat lines. He'd been brought to an intelligence network that preserved knowledge from individuals who possessed information multiple governments wanted accessible, but which prosecution would have destroyed or made unavailable. Klaus was given access to some of Weber's letters, documenting his isolation, his intelligence cooperation, and his exile in Argentina. He was shown portions of Weber's memoir explaining the Edelweiss network and justifying choices that prioritized information over accountability. And he was told that his grandfather had served purposes that transcended simple prosecution or exoneration, that post-war intelligence realities had created gray zones where justice and pragmatism negotiated arrangements that public accountability couldn't accommodate. The Alpine Refuge was sealed after documentation, with memorial marker acknowledging that Oberst Friedrich Weber had disappeared near this location in 1949, his fate revealing complexities about post-war intelligence arrangements that challenged simple narratives about justice and accountability. Among those few who knew complete truth, there was acknowledgement that post-war intelligence history involved moral compromises that served pragmatic purposes but which created accountability gaps that troubled those who valued justice over information preservation. The Edelweiss network had been one arrangement among many where governments prioritized intelligence gathering over prosecution, where knowledge was valued more than accountability, and where individuals who should have faced consequences instead received protection in exchange for cooperation. Oberst Friedrich Weber had ridden his motorcycle into Italian Alps on April 28, 1949, and vanished into a world where intelligence priorities transcended justice imperatives. He'd spent 9 years in Alpine Refuge being debriefed and 24 years in Argentine exile living under assumed identity, serving purposes that multiple governments needed but couldn't publicly acknowledge. His story revealed that post-war arrangements were more complex than public narratives suggested, that Cold War intelligence operations required compromises that justice considerations would have prevented, and that the line between serving collective security interests and evading individual accountability remained contested territory where simple moral judgments couldn't capture full complexity of choices made in circumstances that peacetime morality rarely confronted. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.